Congress in 2018 probably isn't going to get much done. Mitch McConnell is still looking to push through as many judges as he possibly can, which could reshape the judiciary for generations to come. But when it comes to policy, when it comes to legislation, their caboodle was probably the tax bill. The one exception to that rule is a bill by Senator Crapo, which would roll back significant portions of Dodd-Frank. And it's gotten almost no attention in the mainstream press, but it has already passed the House of Representatives, and it may pass the Senate any time now. And if it does, it will only have been done with the help of Democrats. There are 3 Democrats in particular that are leading the way on this. You have Heidi Heitkamp, John Tester, and Mark Warner. Mark Warner, this is a true believer. This is somebody who has pushed this kind of policy for a long time. He's not doing this for electoral reasons. Heidi Heitkamp and John Tester, meanwhile, may have some sympathy for the underlying policy, but are banking enormous amounts of campaign contributions in order to fend off challenges in 2018 from Republicans in North Dakota and Montana, respectively. The way the bill's being crafted is fairly non-controversial. It's saying, well, this is a bill that's just for community banks. Dodd-Frank was a well-intentioned bill to regulate Wall Street so that the too big to fail banks could never again crash and take down the entire economy. It didn't actually accomplish that, but that was its mission. And so the author of this new bill say, well, when it was trying to do that, it took too broad of a brush, and it swept up all of these poor community banks and forced all of this new regulation on them, and it's stifling them. But if that's true, one has to ask the question, why is Citigroup spending so much time and effort and money to lobby on this particular bill if it's actually to benefit their competitors, which are community banks? And the answer is complicated, but whenever there's a bank bill moving through Congress, you can assume that the major banks are going to try to get something good out of it. You know, far be it for them to let some financial reform bill go through without their input on it. Separately, when people talk about community banks, you might be thinking about the tiny bank that was in what's that Christmas movie that everybody loves? You know, you might be thinking about the Potter's little community bank, but that's not what we're talking about here. Congressional aides refer to the banks that are being affected by this as stadium banks. In other words, they might not be Citibank, but they're big enough that they can have a stadium named after them. And so what it would do is take a lot of restrictions off of these stadium banks so that they can be unleashed to do some of the same types of things that the too big to fail banks were doing, pre-crisis. So that sets you up with these multi-billion-dollar, couple $100 billion worth of assets banks that are now involved in much riskier activity. And the Republicans and the Democrats that are joining them would say, well, it's small enough that it won't take down the entire economy. That's a very tricky gamble for them to take. Now, Citigroup in particular appears to be pushing hardest for a provision that would be a small tweak in language, but what it would do is allow them to use the municipal bonds that they own or that they may go out and purchase and count those as capital. So one thing that Dodd-Frank did is it said, okay, if you want banks to be safer and sounder, they have to have more capital. They have to have more cash lying around so that when there's a downturn, they can keep paying their bills. They can keep paying their counterparties, because if they can't pay their counterparties, then their counterparty collapses, and that's how you get a cascading effect, and that's what creates a global financial crisis. So if banks have enough cash on hand, then you have a buffer against a huge crisis. And so the bank is saying, okay, that's fine, we'll have cash on hand, but let us count these municipal bonds as cash on hand. The problem there is that municipal bonds, and you don't have to be a Wall Street analyst to know this, are not cash. They can be awfully risky, and they can be awfully illiquid. They can fluctuate dramatically. Towns might declare bankruptcy. Trump is, in fact, going after states and cities in this recent tax bill. He's whacking their sources of revenue. So just as you're doing that, that's going to hurt the value of these municipal bonds that Citigroup is going to then be able to say, well, look, sure, we've got lots of cash lying around us right here. And when you look at the cash, it's a bunch of municipal bonds, which is not the kind of thing that you can use to pay a counterparty in the event of a crisis.
It sounds like 60 votes is what would be needed. There's no...
60 votes would be needed, but they already have, well, there's 51 Republicans, there's 13, so they're at 64. So at this point, you'd have to peel some people off, which with enough pressure, I think is certainly possible. I think for somebody like Doug Jones, who's supportive of this, he ran as a populist. I don't understand how this helps him, get reelected in 2020, except through increasing campaign contributions. If this truly were a community bank bill and it were community banks versus the big banks, then a populist could say, yes, I support community banks, I support credit unions, I support alternative forms of organizing and capital to these big banks. But that's not actually what this is. This is using the label of community banks in order to give gifts to much bigger banks. The three Democrats taking the lead on this, Heidi Heitkamp, and I'm told Heitkamp played a significant role in drafting the legislation with Crapo. So you've got Heitkamp, Tester, and Warner, but you have another 10 Democrats who are supportive of this effort, which includes Angus King, who's an independent from Maine, but he caucuses with Democrats. Tim Kaine is among the Democrats who are supportive of this, which is politically tricky for him because this bill makes it almost impossible for the government to crack down on unfair lending practices. And one of Tim Kaine's kind of legislative legacies is cracking down on unfair lending practices. And so it's going to take some gymnastics for him to find himself in a place where he can support this bill, which will undo some of his own legacy. People are speculating that he's doing it as a favor to his home state Senator Mark Warner, as well as to, this is something that the donor class is very interested in. But we'll see. He's currently a sponsor of the bill, but with enough pressure from the grassroots, he may end up pulling back. One thing that's interesting here is that the group Indivisible, which is not exactly a group, it's hundreds of small groups around the country organized around resistance to Trump, has actually decided that they're going to make a stink about this, that they're going to try to pressure the Democrats who are on it and the Republicans to try to stop this, because Republicans can't do it alone. They need Democratic help in order to roll back Dodd-Frank, and the question is whether or not Democrats are going to give it. So check out the reporting. There's a great team of reporters on it. David Dayen, Lee Fong, Kate Aronoff, Zed Jelani, Aida Chavez. A lot of people contributed to this major piece that we published today.